time.
Okay.
So my guest today is Professor Richard Bellamy, Professor of Political Science at UCL. Professor Bellamy joined UCL in 2005 as, in fact, the college's first Professor of Political Science. He was founding editor of the new department and then director of the School of Public Policy from 2005 to 2010. He was then director of UCL's European Institute, which he also established from 2010 to 2015. And among many other academic posts he's held, he was academic director of the European Consortium for Political Research from 2002 to 2006, and the founding chair of the Britain and Ireland Association for Political Thought from 2008 to 2013. And he has co-edited the Critical Review of Social and Political Philosophy since 2001. Professor Bellamy is the author of or editor of a large number of books, including, to name but a few, Modern Italian Social Theory, Liberalism and Modern Society, Liberalism and Pluralism, Citizenship, a very short introduction, Political Constitutionalism, which won him the Spitz Prize in 2009, and you will know, because you've read part of this book, A Republican Europe of States, about which we will be speaking today. So Richard, thank you very much for joining me for this interview.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let me begin just reflecting on A Republican Europe of States, which I think rests on an extended contrast between cosmopolitanism on the one hand and statism in political theory. Would it be fair to say that what you're trying to do is to draw out the truth in each without succumbing to the excesses of either of those views?
Yes, that's right. So I suppose the strength of cosmopolitanism I see is that it does ask us to accept the moral equality of individuals and our obligations towards people, regardless of which country they may be in. And that view becomes, I think, ever more compelling, the more interactive our world becomes. So maybe before we knew that much about what was going on in the rest of the world, you could think to yourself, I have as much in common with people in Africa as I do with Martians. But that it really isn't a credible view anymore, I don't think. But I think sometimes the tendency of cosmopolitans is they rightly talk about the inadequacies of states, but they're at risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because states, particularly the democratic welfare states of Western Europe, have been the best mechanisms for achieving justice for their citizens and a credible context for democracy that we've had so far in history. And so what I've tried to do is ask, well, how can those systems be adapted so that there's a recognition of our cosmopolitan obligations and the context within which they've got to operate, without, in a sense, diminishing their capacity to do the good things that they can do for their citizens, and to some degree spread that capacity across the globe. And I think that for various reasons, that's more likely to happen within the context of a kind of association of states, rather than creating one big global state.
Can I just ask you a little bit, just to expand on that point about states, because that's very interesting. I think, I mean, one way of interpreting what you're saying is that, well, states are just instrumentally useful. They deliver welfare and democracy to the populations that live within the boundaries of their states, and however that comes about, that's a very valuable function. I mean, another way in which people sometimes think about states is that they, in a way, incorporate the common life of a people that is behind the states. Do you have this idea of a people constituting a state, as well as states being simply instrumentally useful for populations in a given territorial area?
To a degree, I do. I think what is true is that I don't think that a people sort of pre-existed a state. I think that though I think that states, once they exist, have a tendency to constitute a people over time. Of course, we live in a world where states have also sort of aggregated with other states, and so that's why you have problems with sort of minority peoples, as in the UK with the Scots, Welsh, and Northern Irish. But nonetheless, I think that within those sort of boundaries and a sort of historical reiterations of interactions between a group of individuals, a certain consciousness and culture develops. So one of the things, I mean, I think that means that belonging to a particular state can have a certain moral value for people. Now, of course, nationalism is certainly a something which has produced many bad things. It's sort of a kind of egoistic self-interest amongst a particular group of people, and often it's entirely false and constructed. And I fully accept both those views, but I think that it can also, at its best, as it were, it's about what facilitates interaction. It's what, in a certain sense, as you were saying, produces a certain solidarity and common feeling amongst people of a manageable kind. And I relate that to another issue that I want to sort of preserve in the world, as it were, which is that there are a plurality of ways of doing things. And I'm someone who likes visiting other countries and seeing how, learning about their cultures and marveling at the ways in which different practices are understood in diverse ways. And I think that that's a great benefit. It's what John Stuart Mill called experiments in living. So I see a world of multiple plural states as allowing experiments in living to occur, and a certain degree of diversity, and that's good too. So it's a way of somehow allowing that coexistence between those diverse political communities that I'm trying to achieve.
That's very interesting, and I mean I can well understand the argument that one doesn't want, so to speak, supranational organisations to homogenize peoples or states and so on, and preserve those experiments in living. Can I pass on to the Republican side of your argument? So in as the title suggests, the Republican Europe of States, you draw on Republican theory to spell out the idea of what's involved in a free state, and you tie that notion of a free state very closely to democracy, to political representation, and to a balance of power within the state. Are these all just implications of requiring the Republican principle of non-domination to be, so to speak, the basic constitutional norm of a state?
Yes. So I mean, you noted earlier that sort of I started off as a scholar of Italian political thought, and non-domination is often seen to have its origins in ancient Roman thought, in Cicero in particular, as a characteristic of the Roman constitutional setup, because the way in which non-domination is characteristically described as the archetype of being dominated is the status of a slave, in the sense that a slave, even if they have a good master, nonetheless, their freedom is limited by the whim of their master. They have no real will of their own. They have to, in a sense, anticipate what the whims and will of their master is going to be. So non-domination is a system which seeks to control mastery by others in various ways. So that leads then to the notion of a sort of self-governing citizenry who achieved that. So yes, so I take that as the one of the things that we are seeking to achieve by entering into a political community in the first place is a condition where we aren't likely to be subjugated by others. So that's the basic legitimacy demand of a political community, but that also means that it can't just be internal to the political community. In a context where you've got other political communities, you've also got to secure conditions where they're not dominated by others in their turn. But because this is it's a civic condition, freedom on this account isn't what you get outside any kind of political community at all. So there's a certain, it's the freedom of the city rather than the freedom of the heath, so from that point of view, it's saying the necessity of those political constructs in order to be a free person at all. And in the context of what the book is ultimately about, namely the EU, it's sort of saying you can't have a free state outside a political context, an association of states, as it were.
So this is saying state of nature theorists step back. The state of nature is not one of freedom. Freedom is essentially a civic property. It's not a natural property of human beings. But that does bring me to my next question, because I mean, someone like Pettit is very insistent on the idea that non-domination is a necessary condition of freedom. But his critics have said, well, what he's really talking about is not a different conception of freedom or liberty, but actually security of liberty.
Yes.
And I sensed, I may have misread the text here, but I sensed in your text that you were in fact rather agnostic on that question. And in fact, your version of republicanism is much more rooted in some idea of political equality, rather than necessarily saying that there's a distinctive concept of liberty, and it's only that distinctive concept that creates the necessary condition for somebody being free. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, yes and no, I suppose. So I think that it's true that when both Quentin Skinner and then elaborating on his arguments, Philip Pettit first sort of identified non-domination as a kind of neglected account of liberty. They wanted to sort of say Isaiah Berlin was wrong to say there were two concepts of liberty. There are actually three, and this one is distinctive in that it's a negative account in some ways. It's freedom from, but it's freedom from mastery rather than freedom from interference. And then, as you say, I mean, a number of theorists, I guess Matt Kramer and Ian Carter in particular, took up this challenge and produced very sophisticated understandings of freedom as non-interference, which they argued could incorporate this notion of non-domination. And so this notion of freedom as distinct from security. That too was, it was a kind of article of faith to destroy this for Pettit, because he thought that the two theorists who'd done the most to attack the notion of freedom as non-domination had been Hobbes and Bentham, both of whom had made this distinction between freedom and security. I think, because I haven't invested that much in devising this third concept, I think I am happy to be agnostic on this point and say, well, what it's shown, in a sense, that security is an essential component of the worth of liberty, if you like, or the possibility of its achievement. And I don't feel that much is lost in highlighting that aspect. However, it's also the case that I've wanted to stress, perhaps more than Pettit, that an intrinsic aspect of taking liberty seriously in this way is that it's related to political and more generally relational equality. So, I mean, Pettit in his most recent work has developed this thought. So he said that one feature of whereby how can you tell that you're in a non-dominating political context? And he says, well, one way in which you can tell this is through what he calls the eyeball test. You can look people in the eye, confident that you have the same status as they do. So it's a condition where that sense of being able to look people in the eye is an intrinsic part of what it is to be non-dominated. And I find that a very appealing idea. And so that is really quite a central part that I've wanted to emphasize. So I still think there's a certain value when you're trying to sort of develop a political theory. I think there's a certain value in sort of saying everything can follow from one central thought, as it were. And you've got one principle rather than lots of different principles. And so I'm happy to sort of say, well, here's my principle, which I think fully articulated captures notions of justice and legitimacy, but it has as an intrinsic aspect of it also equality. And I think I do find it more compelling than simply the appeal to equality. I think it gives even those people who perhaps aren't so concerned with equality as so maybe are concerned more with freedom than with equality, a reason for thinking that equality is important, namely that they won't be secure in their liberty outside this sort of condition.
I think it's also fair to say that you probably give a higher value to political participation than Philip Pettit. I mean, in some ways, one way of reading Pettit's work is to say, well, look, as long as the structure of the Constitution has a suitable balance of power, that's fine. But I think you attach much more importance, I think, to active citizenship. I mean, as indeed a large volume of your work has done.
Yes, no, that's right. So again, you sort of alluded to an earlier book on political constitutionalism, and my argument there was that it's not possible necessarily to sort of say, right, here is the best way of working out what the ideal of non-domination is in terms of the best sort of legal structure. And that could be operated by sort of experts in non-domination, as it were. My thought is, well, but that kind of reintroduces the notion of non-domination, of domination into your very structure, because it goes against that intrinsic equality. So it also links up with my commitment to pluralism and the fact that people can have a range of different moral values which they regard as being important in their lives. So I think from that point of view, it becomes vital to have a political system which recognizes everyone as being equals, having equal status, where they have to negotiate their what kind of world is going to best realize what forms of life are important to them. So again, this is why I think you need to have many different states, because you're going to have a plurality of different ways of living together, which if you're to sort of treat people equally, you've got to give them that diversity in order to express the full range of human well-being, etc. So from that point of view, participation becomes very important.
So I think that brings me to my next, and I'm afraid this has got to be the final question, but it relates to this question of a diversity of peoples, because I think a striking feature of the way in which you apply Republican theory to the European project, and I should say to those watching this that we're recording this at a time when it still has to be determined how the UK stands to Europe in the future. But I think a striking feature of your Republicanism is your understanding of European integration as involving not the creation of a single European people. I mean, you sometimes talk about democracy rather than democracy, but instead as an ever closer union of European peoples. And you term that Republican intergovernmentalism. Why resist the idea of the peoples of Europe forming a single polity as the process of European integration develops from the Republican point of view?
Well, I suppose it's again that I mean there are a number of reasons for it. So one quite basic one is that we referred earlier to the notion of balancing and the balance of power. And so the Roman constitution was one which was built around balancing the power of the aristocracy with the power of the ordinary Roman citizens, the plebeians, and freedom existed in that balance, so that there was no kind of domination of one by the other. So I think that similarly, people talk in international relations very often of a balance of power between states as what achieves that possibility of states not dominating each other. So I think that one of the achievements of the European Union has been that it seeks to achieve a balance between the different states, one which has rendered small states like Ireland or even Luxembourg as strong in their way, have as much say as very big states like France and Germany and the UK for as long as it was a member. So I see that as actually something which preserves the freedom. One reason for entering, ironically, given the talk about taking back control, one reason for entering such a union is that it enables you to keep control in a context where, contrary to the talk about no deal, when you do come to a deal, because there will have to be some arrangement that the UK has with the EU, it's an arrangement which isn't that of the bigger partner, which will be the EU in this case now, over the UK. So one of the sort of strange features of this whole Brexit process is that precisely what was preserving the sovereignty and the control of the British people in an interactive context was membership of the EU, because there are very clear rules which are based on trying to preserve the equality of the different member states, and to find, it's a very consensual organization, which some people find maddening, but the rationale for that is to ensure that however big or small they may be, they can each look at each other in the eye. They meet the eyeball test between each other. So now I think that if you created a single people, that would make the EU likely to be much more hierarchical in its organization. And to the extent that some of these different groups existed, there would be, I think, ironically, more possibilities for domination of one group over another. I think also, one big aspect of European citizenship isn't so much voting for the European Parliament. It's the free movement between the different member states. And one reason why you might want to move between those different states is because it gives you a range of options of where to go if you don't dislike your current state, something which I kind of rather miss the thought of, given that the current state doesn't seem very pleasant here at the moment. But I mean, it's something which has been important for many people who came to the UK, regarding it as a land of opportunity for them. So so that's another reason to not want to create a single European people, because you would lose that aspect that you have a plurality of peoples and a plurality of opportunities that are provided by their existence.
Well, thank you for that, and I'm afraid we must conclude on that. This is obviously a conversation which could go on, and indeed I suspect will go on for a very long period of time. But I'm particularly grateful to you today for actually highlighting the way in which quite complicated ideas of political constitutionalism and the construction of a republic actually play directly into our understanding of current public affairs. So thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you.
Thank
That
you.
was great.